The fact is that in religion, the evidence is never going to be clear enough. I think that's by design, to force us, to compel us to faith, to force us to obey the Lord. We're given roughly equally poised possibilities. There's good evidence in some respects. Evidence is lacking in other respects. What the Lord is really trying to figure out, I think, is what do we want? What kind of people are we? Placed in a situation where we can choose either side. What do we want to do? What do we want to be? What kind of people do we want to be? And so he gives us this situation where we can listen to what our inner spirit tells us, or we can trample on it.
There are still those who, even with the vast amounts of evidence that we have for even the biblical record, still refuse to believe. Isn't it nice that we are still allowed to have our freedoms to be human, to continue learning, to either believe or disbelieve? I will grant that to them.
Ultimately, the science, the history, the archaeology are not going to force us to believe. They're not going to compel us. They're not going to give us absolutely rock-solid foundations for our faith. That's not to say that evidence is irrelevant, that you shouldn't use your mind in coming to a conclusion about what's plausible and what's not. But I think there's no Christian out there, really, who's come to a testimony of the resurrection of Christ because he or she was compelled to by archaeological evidence. That evidence doesn't exist.
Belief, proof. The idea is, you prove it to me, you prove it to me. No, that's not how it works.
You ultimately have to say that the Jesus of the Bible, in effect, calls to me, summons to me, speaks to me, and that I believe this is true. I think the evidence doesn't rule it out. I think there's evidence for it, enough for me to make a rational decision, to go with that. Ultimately, the decision to believe in Mormonism as to believe in Christianity in general comes down to spiritual impressions from God.
No, there are too many. The evidence, preponderative evidence, would argue so strongly against Joseph Smith being the author of the text. And intellectually, if you seriously study the Book of Mormon, you can come to no conclusion other than the Book of Mormon was exactly what Joseph Smith claimed it to be. A record written by ancient Hebrew prophets, translated by the gift and power of God.
I think that it strains credulity to suppose that Joseph could have done the research to put all these things together, or alternatively, that Joseph did it by sheer chance.
No. No. How? Are you kidding?
Now, there's one explanation that I really get a kick out of out there. There's a fellow that I've corresponded with from time to time who believes that an unnamed group, an uncertain number of people, at an unspecified time in an unidentified place for motives that are unknown, did all the research for the Book of Mormon, and then for reasons that he can't explain, gave the manuscript to Joseph Smith and allowed him to publish it without giving him credit for reasons that he also doesn't explain. Now, if you do that, you can claim anything, because his group could have been anywhere, and there could have been 5,000 of them doing research at all times. This is the kind of theory that's unfalsifiable. It's just silly. But if you get into the real world, if you look at people like, Solomon Spaulding, who's been proposed as an author, or any of the others, they just don't have the wherewithal. I like a point that Hugh Nibley made. He said, it's not a question of who wrote the Book of Mormon in the 19th century. The question is whether anybody in the 19th century could have written the book at all. And his answer was no. And that's my answer too.
There's different kind of testimonies you can have. You can gain an intellectual testimony by studying the text and looking at the Hebraisms and so forth, and gain that kind of a testimony, I suppose. There's a testimony, that's a testimony of the head, I suppose you could say. There's a testimony of the hands that come from studying its principles and teachings and living them and see what effect they make in your life, and that's an important kind of testimony to have as well. But ultimately, the foundation of our testimony has to be a testimony of the heart. Not just the heads and the hands, but the heart. And by the heart, I mean the witness that comes as you study that text and invite the Spirit to direct your thoughts and feelings and receive the confirmation that it's the Word of God.
I think it's important to realize that when Latter-day Saints talk about testimonies, they're not merely talking about receiving intelligence from their own hearts. They're talking about personal revelation from God. That's a different matter. Can we trust our own hearts? Maybe not. Although in many cases we're told, follow your heart. It's not always a bad thing. But it's not a matter of trusting our hearts. It's a matter of trusting God. It's a matter of trusting what God tells us. And we're not the first people in the Christian tradition to think that in some ways God will speak to our hearts. You remember the disciples on the road to Emmaus who, after they've had the encounter with Jesus, say, "Did not our hearts within us burn?" We should have known. We knew it was Jesus because our hearts told us so.
Do you believe it is true?
I believe the Book of Mormon is true with all my heart.